Hi everybody, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. Today we have Mr. Josh, who is back from his Star Wars on High. Please introduce yourself, tell everybody what you're about. For those folks who missed our first podcast, we had pretty interesting discussions.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me back. I guess it's been about probably 2 weeks now since we had our first conversation. I have, a YouTube channel where I just talk about anything Star Wars that kind of pops up. And this fits right in there, just talking about the prequels, and excited to be back.
And just to let the new folks in on how this whole thing started, we started interacting on social media, YouTube channel, and I really enjoyed Josh's work on YouTube. It's specifically his opinion on prequels era. He'll tell you all about this. He grew up with them. So the first time, this is our part 2. In our first podcast, we covered some central themes of the prequels where we agree, disagree. You had your point of view, I had mine, and I think I came away learning, and this is the reason I wanted to do part 2. How are your feelings on our first effort?
I thought it was a lot of fun, and I think the questions you asked were not questions that I guess even thought through sometimes. So a lot of those reactions were kind of off the cuff, right? In a good way, I think, in a good, like, what's my first thought? Sometimes you can like something, right? You can like a book or a movie and not even think about all of the themes or messages behind it and why you had the reaction you did. So I think it was fun to kind of dive deeper. And, I think it's always good to, and we talked about this in the first episode, but I'm a big prequels fan, but I've never said they were perfect, right? So, I think it is good sometimes to, even though we might disagree, be able to, kind of dive into that and acknowledge those differences. So I'm definitely excited for part 2.
I do apologize a little here, guys. Last time we talked about central themes.
Right.
And we did discuss that, we both acknowledge that there's some greatness in prequels in terms of storytelling. I also brought my point of view, how I felt a little bit about sequels. That's something we might leave for another time. But the whole point of this podcast and inviting you over is to let folks know that there's so much white noise out there, and people like going on a hyperbole and putting things, like blowing everything out of proportion. The idea here is to let everyone know, look, we can have a decent conversation, learn from each other. And that's the whole point of Star Wars fandom, where we can walk away more informed. Like, so this is where this person is coming from. This is what he has learned. And I felt that talking about the themes of Star Wars, the content, rather than the packaging, was very important the first time around. Sure. So in this podcast, what I want to do is I want to talk about now the packaging, the filmmaking, the film aspect of the prequel trilogy, and also focus in on one specific character, obviously Anakin. He is the hero, he is the star. First, I wanted to ask you, how would you, like in your mind, because you grew up with the prequels, how would you compare the filmmaking in the prequels versus the original saga?
So there's the obvious thing about all the in the 6 Star Wars films that George Lucas made, of always pushing the boundaries of the technology at the time, right? And so for me, someone who grew up in the late 90s into early 2000s was when I was, as a kid, seeing movies. When you watch the prequels, when you watch the originals for the first time, it's definitely not as impressive as it was to all those folks who saw those movies, back in the late 70s and the 80s, because that was boundary pushing stuff, right? And I felt like I had that same reaction in the prequels, right? As we talked about last episode, we have like the on Naboo, I think I said Tatooine last time, but on Naboo, we have the underwater chase with the giant sea creature, right? All of the CGI usage was really, now by today's standards, it doesn't look that great, but at the time, I mean, he was pushing the boundaries. So I felt like in both movies, and this is one thing that I think, to George's credit, I think it opened him up to criticism, with maybe the overuse of CGI. He went back and even like added CGI to the originals and some of his remasters, and people were like, what are you doing? But overall, I really commend George Lucas for his, attempt at always giving the imagination, giving us, things we could never have imagined on screen with the best he had. I mean, if he could make the prequels today, I mean, imagine how good they would. I mean, heck, if he could make the originals today. Now, one thing, for me that I will say, and I'll probably pass it back over to you, is the movies do feel very different, right? And part of that is just the passage of time. But I think you recall, when Rogue One came back, and that felt so much more like the originals. Of course it did. It took place, literally moments leading up to it. But he did not necessarily capture it. Almost felt like the technology in the prequels looked better than what they had in the original trilogy. So, I'll pass it back to you and get your thoughts. But that's kind of my first, take on the film making aspect of it.
Yeah, I was just finishing high school when episode 1 came out in theaters. I was turning 19 and I was considering what I'm going to do next. And, I started pursuing animation career. I went to college here in New York. I'll tell you this, when the prequel, the first Phantom Menace came out, obviously it's no big secret that it's the most heavy usage of the sets and live extras and everything was in the first prequel film. Yeah. It diminished significantly part 2, which I believe majority of it was shot against the blue screen with some real props still in there, like
right.
the speeders over Coruscant, stuff like this. And episode 3 was entirely shot against blue screen. Just talking about the first episode, I felt there was absolutely technological wizardry on a different level. We did have in late 90s CGI creatures. We did not have CGI actors.
Yeah.
You would have like a creature or a prop or something happening, or a visual effect that you could check out for a couple of seconds, say, oh, wow, that's cool. That's a new visual effect. That's the trend in cinema. But you never faced a character like Jar Jar Binks for an extended period of time who would stand there and deliver storyline, deliver comedic relief, and also have this connection to young Anakin. And even back then in 1999, I felt that the CGI was exceptionally well done, but it was still CGI.
Yeah.
And even by today's standards, it's very hard not to notice unless it's something like a robot from Rogue One, which is A, phenomenally done, but 2, it's a robot. He doesn't emote like a living creature. So it's very easy to pass up and say like, wow, I didn't even know he was, CG when it comes to Jar Jar Binks. And just to throw it out there, I was not even annoyed when he came out. He comes out, he has this funny way of talking and he's like all over the place. He's jumping, he's, very messy and he's like, stumbles and falls. And I immediately interpreted it as like, okay, that's a children's comedy. He's there to relieve the pressure to kind of like connect with this little boy because he's boyish himself. He's very childlike. But still, it was annoying for me because on the technological standpoint, because here's a digital actor and I understand the passion and hard work that went into him, including the actor that portrayed him. But unfortunately, it just didn't lend itself. And particularly later on in the episode, when you see, which I think the reason I'm talking about episode 1 is because even though it has the most real stuff in it, it represents the problems of the entire prequel trilogy. And it is later on when we start seeing the battle of Naboo. We see the Gungan army versus the droid army. And it's just, suddenly you're like submerged, you're taken out of a live action film and you're submerged into this like Pixar movie. I'm like, And I'll to the credit of the animators and CGI artists that went to work on this stuff, I think they still look pretty incredible today. I still think they hold up from artistic point of view, but unfortunately, it's not it's not there.
It's not just a Star Wars issue with the use of CGI, right? I'll hear, I hate going to the DC well all the time, but I'm a big DC fan, and Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, those are big complaints with those movies. Is they're and the CGI is significantly better today than it was 20 years ago. And people still, a lot of especially older viewers have a hard time feeling like those characters, to your point, are real, like they're there. And I think to piggyback, off what you said, I think the Phantom Menace is probably the worst looking today of the 3, just because technology gets better every year and so quick. But also, I don't think they utilize some of the tricks filmmakers use today. And what I mean by that is like the fight for, like you just talked about with the Gungans and everything, that was in broad daylight, which is very hard to hide the rough edge of the CGI. You'll notice back to DC, Batman vs Superman, all those fight scenes are at night for a reason. Black Panther, they fight in that underground tunnel with the 2 CGI characters. They sometimes will use darkness to hide the rough edges. And to I mean, and on one hand, it's a credit that they went for it. I know that's exactly probably what George wanted to see.
Yeah.
And like you said, it looks totally animated. But he wanted to show that battle. He showed it in the middle of the day, and he went for it. And to your point, yeah, it looks almost, I don't want to say video game-esque, but it does look
like a cutout in CGI, especially in the
Yeah.
earlier video games like PlayStation 1 and 2 era, where the CGI was so ahead of the in-game graphics. And you would see a pre-rendered cutscene like Final Fantasy games. Onimusha had phenomenal CGI, graphics. And you looked at it, it was like, wow, this is so impressive. And, it's also was disappointing to me to see in Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones when the clones themselves were CGI. Like, I understand the filmmakers' excitement behind the new technology, but when it's when it's real people, and it's like, oh my god, the whole beauty of these live extras, like the original Stargate film, which I believe it held up until that point one of the biggest records in the usage of extras and all the people on screen in a single shot, and it's just so impressive. That quality, it's just impossible to replace. And Josh, what I want to do next is, we're kind of like veering off from the aspect of filmmaking back into themes of the Star Wars. But I want to talk about Anakin Skywalker because he's the vessel through which the prequels flow. He's the center of it all.
Yep.
And the last time I asked that question where we left off, and I want to continue today, let's talk about the unmasking of Darth Vader. And the first question I want to ask you is, for somebody who grew up as a kid with prequels, what is your perception of Anakin in prequels versus the original films?
I've thought about this, and we'll probably have to go back and forth a little bit. In my head, it is so hard to unmask a character like Darth Vader. His stature, his voice. Even when we briefly see him without a mask, that moment is shocking in Return of the Jedi when he takes off the mask. You're like, oh, it's like this dude. He looks beat up, and when we kind of get the emotional moment with him and Luke, it can be so hard to create a young version of the big bad we know who meets all the expectations, right? We have this voice, this presence, this force choking, he just took over the screen every time he was in the original trilogy. And so would be so hard to get that character right as a young one. And George made the decision, and to his credit, we've gone back and forth in this. He really saw his vision on the prequels, or what, at the time, what his vision was or what he wanted to do. For better or for worse, he wanted to show a young Anakin. And I think it is so hard to show this like little boy they call Annie, literally Annie, is supposed to be, James Earl Jones, voiced guy at the end. And it is hard, even for me who really likes Hayden Christensen. And I think we're all excited he's back in Obi-Wan.
Oh yeah.
He's part of Star Wars, and he got beat up for that. And
I think he was wonderful. I think he's one of a few things that I truly enjoyed about prequels. And while we can all recognize that there was some actor directing that went wrong.
Yeah, script.
The performances that he gave, the performances that Liam Neeson gave, Natalie Portman, Ewan McGregor, they were wonderful.
Yeah. And with Hayden, and to your point, what you just said, I mean, there were definitely some script choices there that lended itself to cheesy dialogue, and we love it. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are, but there's an entire subreddit, on Reddit, prequel memes, where all the lines have that, and I guarantee you the people who started that subreddit are from the same generation as me, who we rewatch those movies, and those lines are just, they're funny, but we love them. They're kind of charming, right? They've become like charming to us. But with Hayden, he was young. I mean, if I correct me if I'm wrong, I think in Revenge of the Sith, he's 22 is what he's supposed to be. Anakin's supposed to be
not even. I think he's supposed to be 19 like Luke, but Hayden Christensen, I believe he's either 19 or 20. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he was young. I mean, he was young is my point. And it was such a, even in the end scene of Revenge of the Sith, towards the end where he is in the Vader suit, and it's like, no, you're like, oh dang, like I never saw him as that, right? I mean, I think the picture, like you said something to me last week that really stuck out, and I kind of called it out in some of my videos recently. Your idea of Palpatine is like this evil, the Emperor is like this evil, almost mystical, and when you saw him as almost like this like Chancellor guy, you were like, oh, that kind of broke the illusion. I think there's a little bit of that trouble too with Vader, because the what is so iconic about Vader? The presence, the mask, the voice. And, for some guy, the guy we imagine putting that on, maybe some this big, powerful, I'm trying to think of an actor who I, even put it with. And so you see this kind of kid. And why I think that really helps add some humanity to Darth Vader, it definitely also, I think for older fans, especially, like I remember my parents, when they were like, oh, this is Darth Vader, it's like this kind of young, like this isn't, because they had seen James Earl Jones, this epic voice. So it's hard. And I think anytime, I don't know who or how they could have done Darth Vader unmasked more effectively. It is such a legendary character to try to explain. And I definitely understand, why some people's reaction was kind of like, oh, he's like this young kind of bratty kid sometimes, like emotional. So anyway, back to you. I mean, where were you at when you saw it? What did you think about this Anakin? Was it who you had thought, or were you like, oh, dang it, he's this like snivelly young man?
So I remember when the first trailer came out, I might have mentioned it the last time, where we had to gather around the public library computer, and the librarian downloaded very, very pixelated trailer, and he blew up on the big screen. We had to see it. And the first two things that popped up at me were Darth Maul, and the reason why I'll bring him, why he's a part of this discussion. And part two was that they were prequels. The librarian was explaining to me it's a prequel, it's going back in time with young Darth Vader, his youth, he becomes adult, and he becomes this villain. And I said, well, gee, why are we doing this? Don't we know this already? But the picture visually that absolutely blew my freaking mind away is, that scene of the, Darth Maul. He's like, bzz, bzz. When this happened in the trailer, people lost their shit, man. Like all the kids in the library. And the reason I'm talking about Darth Maul so much, as far as the films are concerned, I feel that Darth Maul worked wonderfully as a villain, exactly in the same fashion that Darth Vader works in the original trilogy. And that is, there's a mystique to them. We don't know their past. They only bring their aspect that is necessary to the film. And with Vader, which we talked about the central themes of it, that every child, every son in the classical Greek myth must step out of his father's shadow in order to become a fully self-realized person. And that's what I felt Vader's function was. So when I saw him, and when George tried to tell us his backstory, I can agree with a lot of sentiment that you guys have, the prequel big fans have. Yeah. And I became a fan of it myself because I enjoy the books, I enjoy the comics. And, at one point you have to tell yourself as a fan, okay, what do I do? Do I keep complaining about this because it's not what I wanted? Yeah. Or can you try to open the book and try to analyze and read into it and try to evaluate this story on its own merit? Something that I don't think is being done in modern fandom enough. And on that standpoint, I say, okay, it was very interesting to see how this young person was shaped and what set his course on this downfall. But to this day, I can't accept him as the Vader that I grew up with. They're completely, entirely different entities, just like Yoda that we saw in prequels with doing the action stuff, the general stuff, versus the quirky, crazy, goblin-like creature who instructs Luke. Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me ask you something. I have two thoughts there that I want to get your opinion on.
Sure.
The first one is, have you ever heard Dave Filoni's explanation of Duel of the Fates, or why it was called Duel of the Fates?
I'm pretty sure I have, but do remind me.
Yeah, so the idea was basically, I'm going to high level butcher this. He has a much better way of putting it. Is that in the fight with Darth Maul and Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan when Duel of Fates plays, the fate that was being decided was Anakin, because the idea was, had Qui-Gon Jinn been Anakin's master, been there to support him, it would have probably set him on a better path. What you said in the last one, Obi-Wan was like, we got another straggler. Like Obi-Wan, who eventually became a really good, valiant master, was not really the one that Qui-Gon Jinn could have been, the one who saw his potential, the one who, kind of stood up to the Jedi Council a little bit in his ways, which I think is a fascinating, take there. Cause I think I never even considered what Duel of Fates was. So I loved that idea, thinking about the Darth Maul fight and the significance there. Mm-hmm. But what I want to ask you, is, and I called this out in the first episode. I'm going to try to not do it a lot here, but
Yeah.
I think the Clone Wars show is now synonymous with the prequel era. Like we have to almost bring it up sometimes.
No, yeah, it absolutely is. It's
What do
part
you
of it.
think? Yeah, what do you think about Anakin in the Clone Wars? Because I personally think the Anakin in the Clone Wars is pretty. To me, I buy that Anakin becomes Darth Vader. Like that, he sells me. I think I don't know if it's just the voice actor's got a little bit of a. He's a little bit more of a hot shot. I don't know. It fits in my head. The
There's
mold
arrogance to that
right,
performance.
exactly. Exactly. So what do you think? I mean, did that character at least get closer to your expectations?
I adore Clone Wars. I think Clone Wars, Rebels, and now the Bad Batch are the absolute finest of Star Wars since 1983. I love it.
Yeah.
When it was first announced, it was a big question mark for me. I said, well, okay, the saga is over. And how are you going to fit 4 tiny insignificant years between episode 2 and 3 and give us not only Anakin, but his apprentice Ahsoka, which doesn't quite jive with the films because, when would he have the time to have a paddle? And it's the biggest issue that some purists have with it, which I disagree with because I said, well, hold on a second. People who always look for continuity and clear progression and all the plot holes being filled don't realize that all storytelling takes place in this fashion. A director or filmmaker starts here and then he says, well, I want to do something else now. Should I be tied by my previous work, or can I just neglect some of what I was doing and go forward? This is how Greek mythology is built. I mentioned it briefly last time. Jason and the Argonauts. In the beginning of the journey, this young man is the protagonist. He is the hero. When you meet him 20 years later with Antigone, he's an asshole. And why is that still relatable to this day? Because that reflects nature, that reflects us, that reflects humanity. So when you look at the Anakin from that point of the prequels, the Clone Wars show, I told myself, wow, okay, he's fleshing him out. He's giving us the reasons why he's doing that way. He's giving us this epic, massive journey, and all of these characters play around Anakin so well. Hell yeah, I bought it. Hell yeah, I'm behind this character. Hell yeah, I'm gonna enjoy it. I am not one of these people who stands behind this iron wall and says, no, this is my Star Wars, and everything else, be damned with it. It's not what I envision. No, I'm very flexible. The story for me needs to work at the very least on its own merit. If it's the prequel movies were not what I expected, and I didn't like them because I didn't think they were effectively made films, and then you look at the Clone Wars, I'm like, okay, it kind of contradicts what we have here, but it's awesome. It's great content. It has Emmy-winning writers, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they were behind Batman the Animated Series, and it shows.
So somewhat, yeah. I think you're dead on, and to your point about continuity having to line up all the time and having some flexibility. At the end of the day, we have to acknowledge it's made up, right? It doesn't exist. And we love it. And that's, and we want it to make sense. So I'm not saying we just break the rules every 5 minutes, but there are times, like you said, that you make a choice and do not understand the thousands of ramifications it could have on your ability to continue to create. And so sometimes you have to say, you know what, I'm going to make a line or two from this movie incorrect to give you a better story. So I totally agree there. I think some fans are way too eager to, point out every plot hole. They exist in it's all made up. So there's plot holes because it didn't really happen. Right. And like you said, different authors and different, directors pick up different things. So I totally agree. And I think, to end, to give it back to you, the end of the point. Yeah. I think the Anakin in the Clone Wars, the animated show is to me makes a total sense that he would become Vader. And it's part of it is because, I think they learned some things from the prequels. Like you said, I think they fleshed out his military prowess, his arrogance, like you said. Like this guy, to me, yes, I could see, and his anger. He would often in the Clone Wars lean into that, anger and aggression. And as I talked about last week, usually for a good reason, right? That's the thing about Anakin that I always did like is that, you can so easily think of the dark side as like, oh, it's just like an evil, nefarious mustache twirling, like, mwaha. But, for Anakin, it was always like a cause that we would get behind. Like, man, I want to save my Padawan. I want to save my wife. I want to save my kids. I want to get married. I want to do these things. And his road to the dark side was paved with good intentions. And I think the Clone Wars continue that. So sorry to get us off topic there, but I think, when you look at the prequel movies and you see Hayden Christensen's Anakin, and it might be like, okay, like, I love his story of him and Obi-Wan falling apart. I love that brotherhood. He doesn't maybe have quite the right swag, for lack of a better word, on screen. Maybe, and we didn't see all of his, military prowess between 2 and 3. So it was kind of like, well, why does he think he should be master? Like, we've only seen him do like 2 things.
Yeah.
When you see the Clone Wars, you're like, oh yeah, I totally get it now. He's like the best they got. He's out there putting his life on the line, making good decisions. And so when you take the prequels, you add in the Clone Wars, and then you get the Vader transformation. I buy it so much more then,
100%.
right? If you just take the prequel films, I totally, I can get like, okay, it's a hard jump. I think was a smart move by them to give us those 7 seasons to see the character. So anyway, I just wanted to, I think that's,
it's a great point. It's a great discussion point. And on that front, I'm a prequels fan through and through, because, when you dismiss the Star Wars logo, at the end of the day, you want a good story. And the Clone Wars show has some of the most amazing, memorable stories.
It does.
Again, talking about Anakin and Vader, the 2 in 1, as both a theme of our discussion and as a cinematic vehicle to tell a story, I want to ask you this next question. What are your thoughts on young Anakin that we saw in episode 1? And how does that work for you?
That is probably, I'm trying to think of, how do I look at it? It was always, when I was younger, my least favorite version of the Anakins, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. And it was, let's just call it what it is. And you can maybe disagree with me, but as the prequels fan, I don't think you will. It was always a little weird to see Anakin and then in Attack of the Clones, him with Padme, right? It was always a little bit like, well, this, again, he was like, they called him Annie. And I thought he was really fun in The Phantom Menace, his pod racing, his kind of like, hey, I made this droid. And he was kind of very genuine. So I don't think he was unlikable, but I think it made the character progression very hard, because you're like, we only have 3 movies here. And so this is before the animated series, like we talked about, a third of the time we spend with young Anakin is like little baby Annie. And it was almost like, it was then hard to reset for 2 and 3. Right. It was kind of like, I saw you, now it set a lot of good foundations. It set the slave angle, it set his mom angle, mm-hmm. I understand why they did it, but it was I know it's a time leap, but it was always, for me as a prequels fan, the hardest, like, okay, like I just saw you and now you're with Padme, and like, that was hard for me. I'll just say that, right? Yeah. I can't even defend it to a huge extent, except for the fact that, it's hard to get an actor who could have actually been, consistent through all of them. Mm-hmm. And you can't really predict, how, if you get a child actor, especially, you don't know how they're going to age. I mean,
it's tough to direct them.
And we know a lot of child actors like kind of age out, right? So, you don't know if you're going to get a kid at, 12 who is going to like blossom by 19, or is going to get worse, if his voice is going to change, if he's going to get really tall, if he's going to be really short, if he's going to, you just don't know. So as a director, it's very hard to have the foresight of like, well, what am I going to do for the next one? But anyway, that was my thought on young Anakin, especially the first time I saw it. Now as a young viewer, it was kind of like, oh, it's like me, it's like, I could be Anakin, right? He's only a couple years younger than me, or about the same age. And he's like, pod racing and building robots. So there was like a likability to him.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure it totally felt organic, his then jump to like, oh, I'm married to Padme in the next movie. You're like, what? Like that's the one thing I recall, even as I was young, being like, that's kind of weird, like that he just get married, like I just saw him as a baby like a couple of years ago. So anyway, I'll pass it over to you.
My framing of young Anakin was, first of all, I just want to throw it out there. I think it was completely horrendous of the fandom to go after this kid. I thought that his performance could have been much, much better in, let's say, somebody prominently known director for working with kids like Steven Spielberg. Yeah, it wasn't his fault at all. And it wasn't even the script's fault. But the first episode, The Phantom Menace, it was the first signal to me that there's something very, very wrong with this trilogy.
Sure.
He doesn't work as a child. First of all, because, and we'll get into it a little bit deeper if we have time, where the conversation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke, where he describes his father, But even putting that on the side, just looking at the prequels as their own entity, it felt that there is this innocence of youth. Like, we all understand the premise. We need to show his hardship growing
Yes.
up. We need to see the
Yes.
separation from mother. You know,
Yep.
it's a classical Greek motif. You know, separation from mom and the trauma of that. We understand that intellectually, but the reason that it doesn't work for me is that the first film could effectively be called The Adventures of Qui-Gon Jinn and Kenobi. He doesn't
Yeah.
affect the plot in any significant way. He's too young. He's too innocent, and there's nothing that you could ask of this kid to influence that story. And I felt like it was such a waste of time. I'm like, hold on a second. Why are we starting this film with these two Jedi over here? Are they the central focus here? Oh, okay. He's trying to do something that he did with Luke. You know, these two droids, and then when they land, we arrive and we meet the hero through these two characters.
Yeah.
That's what he's trying to replicate. You know, that rhythm. But it just didn't work because young Anakin is not who I perceived in that film. And now to get into the specific scene, which I want to talk about, of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke, where they talk about this clearly an adult person. It almost feels like when Kenobi is talking about him, he says, look, he was already a great pilot when I met him. And no, he doesn't mean pod racer. He means a pilot. He means a person who is young, impulsive. He has his own ideas about who he wants to be. It sounds like somebody who is in control of his destiny versus the young Anakin.
It's Clone Wars Anakin, like we just talked about.
Thank you. And you know, it makes me wonder. I'm aware that there's a prequel trilogy of books that are written by a fan, which actually it tried to incorporate some of the ideas from the films, but he wasn't a huge fan, and he said, well, if I were to make my own version of those films, let me start with an 18-year-old Anakin who is not a slave. It's not about slavery on Tatooine. He's living on the frontier, this boring life, just like Luke was, and he had this potential in the Force, and he said, well, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to go and fight in the Clone Wars. You know,
Okay.
yeah.
Interesting.
So the question that I want to ask you is, how do you feel the dynamics? We're talking about now episode 4, A New Hope. The dynamics between Anakin Skywalker mentioned there, Owen Lars, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. What's going on there? And how do the prequels relate to that?
Yeah, I think, and I might have already jumped the gun, but it does, you know, when he talks about, you know, he's talking to Luke about his father, it to me is very much the Clone Wars Anakin. And I, you know, as I said it till I'm blue in the face, but I'm rewatching the Clone Wars. I just watched before this 2 episodes of season 6. It's the ones where Mace Windu and Jar Jar go on that adventure. But I'm watching it with my wife for the first time. And as someone who, my wife grew up, I mean, my father-in-law is like a massive original trilogy fan. I mean, on repeat in the background all the time. But when she grew up, a lot like your experience, you know, her dad was like, I don't really care about these prequels. And so my wife has forgotten a ton of the prequels. And so as we watched Phantom Menace, we rewatched Clone Wars, then we're watching the animated series, and then we're going to watch Revenge of the Sith and the 7th season kind of combined. We're going to like go flash back and forth.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that. But what I've heard her say like 20 times, she's like, man, like this Clone Wars show seems like extremely relevant to the prequels. Like she's like, this is filling in like so many gaps for me.
Yeah.
And I think George and Dave or whoever really made the decision realized some of the expectations that we had set in episode 4 and some of the, you know, eventual character progression. We needed more of that. And that's where the Clone Wars came in. So when we hear, you know, the description, it's so funny because I never really grew up in a Star Wars world where the prequels didn't exist. Yes, I was very, very young. You know, there was like a 3 or 4 year period in my life where there were no prequels. There were only the original trilogy. So I never really, it's fascinating to me hearing you talk because you're like, well, when I heard this, you know, when I was, you know, however old, I had this expectation you talked about in the last episode. You're like, I had this expectation of like these kind of space wizards, you know, referring to the Jedi. And then you had this expectation of Anakin based on Obi-Wan, when my entire life, I always knew who Anakin was. Like I never had to make it up in my head. So, and I think this just goes to what I said last time. You can't change how old you were, what was around when you saw them.
Absolutely.
And so so you're like, hey, I had these expectations based on what you showed me, based on the movie you made, and then you're showing me these characters in these moments, and like that's not what I had from what you told me. This doesn't line up with what you told me, but I always had both. So like, I never read too much into it. So it's like, hey, I knew your father. I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen I know how he knew his father, right? Like it never was up to my imagination. And I just find it fascinating listening to you, calling out all of these, like, this is what they said in episode 4. Yeah. And then you show me this character in episode 1, 2, 3, and like, you're not lining up, because you had to fill it in for yourself. Yeah. You had to fill it in for yourself.
Josh, and I think it makes all the difference in the world. And that's one thing that's really, really beautiful about it. I remember watching it as a kid with that stupid, Russian dubbing. And that scene was just such a beautiful exposition scene where, he sits him down. He says, this is who your father was. And, this young person called Darth Vader, whose first name is Darth, there were no such titles back then. He betrayed and murdered your father. And I think it's my personal feeling. Nobody knows what was inside of George Lucas's mind, and everybody splits hairs about it, and tons of books are written about it, but nobody knows if at that point in time he decided to flip the switch and make him a single character. He is your father. And for me, it was a very interesting dynamic as a kid, and obviously as an adult you read more into it, but with that initial memory, that first impact of a child. And for me, as a kid, I always wanted to learn, what was this Anakin like? Why was he there staring at the, twin moons of, twin sons of Tatooine, and decided to leave the farm? And what was the clash between him and Uncle Owen, who I always interpreted as his brother? And, what's the clash? Why would Lars Owen refuse to talk about him? What kind of conflict of clash? It looks like they had this very rich history, obviously being family members and having to spend a lot of time together. And that also little antagonism going on there of Lars versus Obi-Wan Kenobi, where he's like, he's just a crazy old man, a wizard. I don't want you to listen to him. Don't pay any attention to him. And fortunately, some of that stuff is being explored in recent comics, where we see, Kenobi, he goes into Tatooine and how he stays in the periphery, and he's minding Luke's growing up, because eventually he will have to, fulfill that role. But I also hope that, for the new upcoming Kenobi show, they'll take the chance and opportunity and explore, put a twist on that scene, and kind of go back and re-examine what the prequels were trying to do, because I felt they were honestly just upside down. He's a half brother from Lars' family who are not even related by blood to Luke. It completely turned it on its head. And for me, it violates the fantasy of it for you. That's why I believe a lot of, purists will say, well, no, prequels suck. This is where all of these inner emotions come forward. And people, because especially people who are not as very expressive, I'm not saying stupid, I'm just people who don't have as many words to describe their feelings. They're saying, no, this is not what I want. This is not how I remember it.
There's a lot of people who will see something, they'll have a gut reaction, maybe they haven't even deep dived into, not that it's invalid, just that they haven't, they're like, for whatever reason, I don't like this.
It's
and
honest.
That kind of ends it for them. Yeah, it just ends it for them. They're not like, I don't need to have hour-long conversations like we're having to debate about it. I just didn't like it. And that's enough for them, right?
Yeah.
And it's something to keep in mind, not to get us off topic, but what we just talked about, and I think it's important because it kind of goes to the purpose of your podcast a little bit with having fans who disagree. But can find middle grounds and can agree in certain areas. I am, and I believe you are, we are not the biggest fans of the sequels here. You might like them a little better than me. I mean, but there are young fans in Star Wars right now who are going to grow up on these movies and are going to have the exact same experience that I had with the prequels. And we have to be cognizant of that when, because when the sequels came out, I made a video about this months back, like I love The Force Awakens, actually. I don't know if we've talked, I actually really like The Force Awakens. I know it's basically A New Hope, but hey, it was fun. I don't care. I thought it set up a lot of very intriguing storylines. I thought Han Solo's death, even though I wasn't happy about it, I thought was like a good, like emotional punch at the end. I was like, oh, I got home. I was like, I told my parents, like, you guys got to come see this, because I knew they would have such a reaction when Han died. And I don't think it paid off for me in the next two movies, neither here nor there. My point is we have to be cognizant of how, and I said this a bunch in the last episode, but where you were, how old you were, what was going on in your life matters for anything. It could be, it could be a Spider-Man movie. Like when I was young, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, he's my Spider-Man. I'll always love that Spider, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And we have such a reaction, I think, a lot of times, and we're all guilty of this, where we want to like explain to people how wrong they are.
Exactly. Thanks for
Sometimes
pointing this out. Yep.
when sometimes their love for something can just be like, yeah, there's problems with it, but I was 12. My dad took me to that movie. I love those memories. I love going with my buddies.
Yeah.
We had little lightsaber fights out front, and I don't care how dumb they were. I don't care if the dialogue was cheesy. Those are special moments to me, and you can't change.
And you can't take it away. Exactly. I think that sometimes when I get into discussions with people say, "Oh, you're either too lenient or you stupid. You don't know the background of stuff. Do you even know what George Lucas intended?" I'm like, "Oh my God, you guys! I can't even open my mouth. How much I'm so absorbed in it that I have to have somebody like a guest, like you just reminded me about the Duel of the Fates thing, which I've known all this stuff. I just have to go to Wikipedia and remind myself over and over again. Oh, okay, that's what it meant. Anyway, as big as a fan of sequels that I am, and I am a fan of them, you can look at something critically and say, they violate my childhood memories of Luke Skywalker as well, believe it or not. But I still like them. They work. Something in them touched me on an intuitive, subconscious level that is it's pleasant to watch. It's interesting. Yes, even The Rise of the Skywalker. There's a lot of stuff that I enjoy, and I find a lot of issues with it at the same time.
It's possible. And we've kind of lost that. We've lost that today. I think. Social media, I think it's a lot more catchy to have really strong, forceful reactions, and you can acknowledge something's not perfect and still like it.
Back to Anakin. We've abandoned him for a little bit. Let's not leave him in the middle of a sandy desert. Anakin's romance. Let's talk about that. Did you buy his romance? Do you think that all of that criticism and slew of memes directed towards it is unwarranted?
So I actually can tell you. So let me lay a little groundwork. I don't know if I've said this yet. When I was young, the prequels came out. Here's how I felt about him. I didn't really care about the Phantom Menace for a lot of the reasons you said. It almost felt kind of pointless. Now as an adult, I understand all the things they were trying to lay out. And then again, the Clone Wars gives us a lot of those characters, But as a kid, I was like, Phantom Menace, I really liked Attack of the Clones, and I really liked Revenge of the Sith. But my least favorite part about Attack of the Clones was, I think, like the scene when he's being her bodyguard on Naboo. Like, I think that is objective. Well, yeah, I think objectively that's my least favorite scene in that movie because it is like, even as a kid, I remember like it almost made you uncomfortable a little bit, like it's, and I blame part of it on the writing. I blame part of it on the age difference I talked about a second ago. Like, I'm like, I just saw this kid, he was 5. Now Star Wars is no stranger to weird love situations, Obi-Wan, Leia and Luke and Han. So it's not uncommon for Star Wars to have their kind of weirdness there. But yeah, I thought it was fine in Revenge of the Sith because Anakin, I thought, was finally looking kind of old enough to actually be with Natalie Portman. And the Clone Wars kind of shows more of their relationship, like with Clovis, the moments where I just watched the in season 6 where, she had a relationship with Clovis in the past. There's a couple times she has to work with him and Anakin gets really jealous. And then in season 6, he like beats him to a pulp, like almost kills his butt. And Padme's like, whoa, we got to cut this out. So I thought in Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones, the Clone Wars show, I was fine with it. I thought in Clone Wars, the first time it was introduced, it was very weak. The dialogue was kind of cringy, and it does deserve the memes it has today. I love both those actors and actresses. I like that they have, I want to say this too, I like that they have a romance because I think that's probably it is a great motivation for a villain. Again, I've said it a couple times. I think the noble motivation that any of us could fall into is always a great one to see your hero trip on because we can relate. And I think it was sad to see him basically murder his wife. And again, with the context of the Clone Wars and the context of his life, how it got away from him, how the dark side it got away from him, right? And he eventually did the very thing he was trying to stop. So I did like that they had a relationship. I thought in Attack of the Clones, its introduction felt really fast. I'll just say that. It felt really fast. It was like, hey, we're here, we're good, we're married at the end. Like that to me was probably the biggest problem with it. And it could have been helped if the first time we met Anakin, he was older and him and Padme kind of had a thing. In the second movie, the thing continues and maybe ends with a secret marriage. And then in the third one, the fall. But because you didn't have any of it in the Phantom Menace and you only had it in the Clone Wars, it obviously feels rushed. I mean, again, even as someone who likes it, it does feel rushed. I like that they had it, but I think it could have been done better.
Okay, that's a lot of interesting points. I might surprise you a little bit.
Go for it, yeah.
First of all, you have a free pass to talk about Clone Wars whenever and however you feel. You might bring him a billion times because we're both huge fans. I can't stress enough how amazing that multimedia event is as a Clone Wars, as books and comics and a TV show. And the second thing is, as a prequel watcher, I saw every single prequel in theaters the first week they came out because I'm a fan. Yeah. I did enjoy part 2 significantly better than part 1. I said, well, Attack of the, especially like everything that has to do with Coruscant and stuff like that. And I told myself, well, this is better. It was a lot easier for me to convince myself. Yeah. And with Revenge of the Sith, it was the easiest. I was like, oh my God, this is on the verge of greatness. I enjoyed it when it came out. Yeah. For me, just like yourself, it felt a little jarring that here's a 10-year gap and just a kid who was like, are you an angel? That's a little, innocent, kind of like androgynous infatuation with a girl. Because, when before puberty hits, before you get those hormonal changes, we're all androgynous. We don't think about love in that kind of relationship. She's love. She's my girlfriend. That's what kids say. Yeah, but they really just want to relate. And that's what happened in the first episode. In part 2, there's a romantic interest there. He says, I thought about her all these 10 years and she didn't even think about me. And here's what I think about their love affair, and I get crucified for it all the time. I love it. I enjoyed it. I think it was really fun. And even in some of the dialogue that people peg as being cheesy and stupid, I'm like, hold on a second. Don't you guys read? At least all European kids and Russian kids have been raised with Hans Christian Andersen and Brothers Grimm on all of those European 18th and 19th century folklore tales where people talk in that fashion, where the young man with a little guitar sings a serenade under the balcony to the girl under the moon. It's romantic. It's overemphasized. It's Romeo and Juliet. And from that perspective, when I was observing their dialogue, it wasn't cringy for me. I was like, why are people laughing? That he's a young man. He's barely standing on his own 2 feet as a young Jedi Padawan. What could possibly go through his heart when he falls in love with a striking woman? Yeah. Can you remember yourself back when you were 16 or 17 and you had your first crush? You lose your marbles. You're like, oh my God, I can't. When he says, I can't breathe, I believed it. I was like, oh my God. She's like backing out on him a little bit. She's like, she wants to friend zone him, but from the very few moments when he starts making advances towards her, they're being reciprocated. Yeah. She likes him too.
To your point, you make a fantastic point that when I was 16, 17, or when any of us were, if I were to rewatch my conversations with girls, you would probably cringe. Like I would probably cringe because that's how we are. And there's a little bit of a cultural thing here where in certain areas, and not everywhere, but in the States, we can be not really, you can be kind of, sharing your feelings in really boisterous ways. Certain cultures can kind of be like, like that's not for me. So that could be part of it, right? There are, like you said, going back through time. Yeah, if you read a Romeo and Juliet, or if you read a Shakespeare poem in class, like if you're in drama class, you'll feel like it's ridiculous. But this was what they, used to do. So there's definitely some cultural bias in there of, how we talk. Absolutely. And so I will grant you that's a great point. They're supposed to be kind of young, hormonal, real, like you said, like when you are, man, I can remember, you have relationships at, 16, like you said, kids, and it's like, I love her, she's the one. As an adult, you're like, okay, well, in hindsight, I was probably a little bit immature, but that is a growing process. Yeah. So that's fair, right? I think you raised some good points there. They are young. Yeah, right?
And especially Anakin. For example, that there's 2 scenes that come to mind. When they're in that chariot and they're about to be taken to this arena in Geonosis, and she tells him, "I deeply, truly love you." I said, "Wow, it all brought it together for me." And again, I didn't find not a single line that cheesy or stupid or cringy. I was like, "Oh wow, these young people trying to babble words to explain to each other how they feel." And I have to say that in the entire prequel trilogy, the strongest moments that have emotional resonance are the scenes between Padme and Anakin, especially in Episode 3. I
Yes.
believe, if I'm not mistaken, that scene was directed by Steven Spielberg, where there's a moment of quiet silence before Anakin rushes off to fight Mace Windu. He's sitting there in the temple, she's sitting there in the apartment, and he cries. He's like, oh man, screw this. This is what I have to do. I'm going to have to commit full force because I want to save her. And she's standing there staring out the window.
Yeah.
That scene, plus the music, is the most emotionally resonant and powerful scene. And that's the reason I wanted to talk about love in the prequels. And I just, for me, they worked.
Well, like I said, and I'll make it double clear. It is so good they used it, right? It's such a good, like you said, there's some of the most emotional moments, especially in 3. And like I said, it is one of the strongest part, like the relationship between, whether the dialogue is perfect or not, the relationship, especially because, you know, there's a likability to them, like Natalie Portman and Hayden, like you kind of want them to make it, like you can't help but be like, and that's one of the strengths.
Very sympathetic,
right. And that's one of the strengths I've always said, like I said last week too, of Revenge of the Sith to me, why it's still my favorite, is like you're watching a car crash about to happen. You know it happens because you've literally seen the results.
Right.
But you're like, I really hope it doesn't. Like maybe he's not, you know, like I remember feeling that way in the theater. I'm like, oh, I know exactly how this ends. Like there's no surprise coming. And like you didn't want it to end that way. And that to me is one of the biggest strengths. So without the relationship, the emotional weight of the prequels would be almost non-existent.
Now that we talked about the relationship and where it leads to, was Padme's death necessary?
Was it necessary? That's a good question. I feel like it was, for the simple fact that I thought her dying would really lead, and especially because Vader thought the twins were dead, would really lead to his continued fall, right? His continued, you know, aggression and rage at himself, which fuels the dark side. So I feel like if she's alive, there's almost an opportunity for a redemption arc, or him to like snap out of it. Like, wait, she made it. You know, I can't work for Palpatine anymore. He can kill me, but I have a wife that, like, you know, I think there's a chance he can go back, right? For her to be dead and for him to think his kids are dead, I think are very necessary for him to continue his fall. I think if George would have left her alive, I think there would have been a lot of us like, well, why didn't he, you know, go tell her how he felt? Or, you know, it would have been harder to me to buy that he continued to the guy who's force choking people out. You know, I'm reading a series of books. They're called the Stormlight Archives. It's a book series by Brandon Sanderson. They're fantastic fantasy books. He's 4 books in. They're very long, epic.
I just picked them up in Barnes and Noble.
Fantastic series. Absolutely love them. I listen to them on Audible. They're so good. Can't recommend them enough. But there's a character, I won't spoil anything for you, but there's one character who later in the series, he discovers a moment he had kind of forgotten. It's a long, you know, without getting into too much details.
Right.
And it's a moment where he had done something terrible, and he remembers, and he's so overcome with like rage at himself and grief. It leads to such a downward spiral in himself. And that, I think, is what happened with Anakin. Is he's like, oh my gosh, I killed. There's no turning back. Like I turned my back on everything. I thought I was doing it for a good cause, and not only did I betray the Jedi, which I was so emotional about that I could almost justify in my head. But like I ended up killing my wife and kids. You know, I can't go back. Like I have to fully embrace this. And I think without her death, he just wouldn't become Darth Vader, to me at least.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And I can definitely see that childhood attachment that you have, that we talk about for a second episode now. Hopefully we'll go into the third with something that I can find to talk about. I'm pretty sure I will. I talk a lot. But I felt that Padme's death scene was completely unwarranted, unnecessary, and worked purely as a tying loose end. Like, oh, by the way, it's never specified or intimated how she and when does she die. It just related to us that Leia says, I remember my mother. I was very young when she died. And that's the end of it that we get. And you can extrapolate from there and say, well, no, that was actually her stepmother. That was Bail Organa's, a wife that never had kids, blah, blah. You can spin the story out of there.
You can feel it. Yeah, you can feel it.
Exactly, yeah. But for me, I felt that And the reason I wanted to show you that artwork once again, remember last time
Yeah.
we had it too, the art piece, and I'll pop it on the screen again for guys who didn't see the previous episode. It's an official piece of artwork by Larry Ashmore, painted in 1993 for Star Wars Top Cards. And it was, the story goes on that podcast from the artist's words himself, that they were looking at it and George was sorting different pieces out. And he said, "Ooh, I really like this one, but let's shelf it for now." Why? Because I want to do something there with that story. It was not molded and shaped yet. But when I saw that picture, I believe either early this year or late last year, Josh, I never responded for fine art piece like this in a very long time, man.
Yeah.
Like I looked at it and it reignited like a firestorm of like childhood imagination in me.
Sure.
And looking at that scene, I'm like, oh my God, this is exactly how I envisioned or pictured their mom, you know. And I felt that if they were to do the prequels alternately, that there would have been plenty of opportunities to show the tragedy of him distancing himself from that family. Remember, have you seen the Breaking Bad and the last season of it?
I've not seen the last. No, I have not seen the last season. I know the gist of it, and I know
you know how it ends.
The downfall. Yes, I do. I know how it ends.
All right. Without spoiling much, there is absolutely heart-wrenching last couple of episodes where he knows what he must do, and he knows that his actions will forever sever him from his family. And I felt as a kid that there's, once again, I want to reiterate that I always imagined that Anakin was this young person who is capable and headstrong, just like Luke, and he wanted to go out there in the galaxy and make a difference. And meeting this young woman who gave him twins, what would make her leave him? I felt that would have made for a much more interesting story than, oh, by the way, and she dies. Because for me, her death added nothing more to his downfall, because I felt that the tragedy of his mother dying and Anakin not making it on time is also one of my favorite things about the prequels. I adore that scene. I love when he attacks the Tusken Raider village and he kills them and he goes and, Mom, I'm here. It touched me. Yeah. Out of the few things, and I think that if every single scene in prequels would have affected me this way, I would have cherished them. I would have propped them on a pedestal. But unfortunately, it didn't do that. But anyway, to that point, it affected me so much. I'm like, oh my God, that works. That alone, that he's failure, that the first prototype of a woman that every child has is his mother. That's what you compare every other woman to. That's, again, a Greek motif, that psyche, when they delve into your heart and soul. And that would have been enough to say that now he's joining the dark side. And now this young wife who has his twins, and she's seeing that he's turning into this monster. Remember that scene where Padme tells him on Mustafar, "Please come with me. Help me raise our children." Again, I'm just talking about that scene gives me goosebumps. And here I am, somebody who's openly trying to admit he's not a prequels, big fan.
Yeah.
It's a great, striking scene. And anyway, just to bring back that Larry Ashmore's artwork, I'm like, oh, gee, man, what would have happened if she had to leave and go into hiding,
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a totally different way to do the story. And it's always, it is always fun to play the games of like, well, what if the prequels were like, what if they did it this way? Would it have the same impact? Yeah. What if they would have had, like you said, Anakin have more of a downfall after the children, like we see in this picture, right? Where he's married, he's got the kids, leaving his family.
Yeah.
Would it have been the same? What they ended up doing was using it as a mechanism, right? So Vader thought he had killed his wife and his kids, that consumed him with rage and grief, that furthered his path to the dark side, and eventually fuels his return. Because when he starts, because I don't know if you've read any of the Vader comics that are supposed to take place between.
I have to catch up. I'm on the volume 1, but I have to catch up. Yeah.
A big thing in the later issues, and I'm definitely not up to date myself, is Vader discovers that Luke's alive, right? His kids are alive, right? He doesn't, and that is what starts to turn his mind to portraying, Palpatine, right? It's like, oh, wait a second, like it's almost it's a hope for him, like. And you see it like he starts it with like, join me, we'll rule the galaxy, right? Like it's still kind of like warped. Like, I got a kid. Like, here's my chance of redemption. And it's not like the reaction of, oh, sweet, I can leave the dark side now and restart the Jedi Order. It's still warped with the dark side, you know, it's like, oh, now I can rule like with my kid, with my son. And in the end, you know, it eventually leads, because he has that son that he thought he had lost. He has his kids. I think without that, it would have been harder to tell the story. How George used the device was to explain, well, why did Vader continue down this path, given what we saw in the prequels? Why would he? Because a logical question might be like, well, why would he still serve Palpatine? You know, except for that Palpatine is stronger than him, right? Why else would he want to work for him? And the answer we kind of get is because he had lost total hope and had kind of devolved into anger and rage based on the guilt and the loss. And I think that was at least effective to fit. To me, it fits the movies. Like, it might not be, because again, like we've talked about several times, because you had to fill in the blanks for yourself, you had an Anakin who might have had to leave. And why would he leave his family? Like, why would he give them up? My story, right, what I was given was, oh, he never knew he had a chance at a family, right? He thought that was gone. He thought he, by his own actions, blew his entire chance. It was his biggest fear, was losing Padme and his kids. And he made it happen. And that alone caused so much grief and anger that it caused him to become this giant monolith, right? This guy who's so devoid of any of the charm and, like you said, you know, kind of arrogance that we saw of arrogance, but like that kind of likable charisma, that swag of Anakin. Like, how did he give all that up? You know, if his kids were alive, right?
Yeah.
It's all about, again, expectations of where we were and what happens. It's always fascinating to just hear, you know, us think about it. And, you know, how could they have done the prequels differently? So many ways, right? And who knows what would have landed the best. We got what we got, and we can always theorize with the rest. It is fun, though. It's fun to think.
Yeah, like I believe it was you said last time that, you know, when Mark Hamill said we caught the lightning in the bottle and how can you replicate it?
Yeah.
We started on this topic on the unmasking Darth Vader, and I want to close off with that.
Yeah.
In regards to prequels and storytelling in general, if you could tie it into the prequels somehow, how much should be explained versus left to imagination, and how far did the prequels succeed in that regard?
That's a great question, because traditionally, funny enough, I don't love prequels like in others. So like if like Game of Thrones, like, oh, we're doing a prequel, it's gonna be hundreds of years before. I'm like, I don't really care, you know, like I don't really, it doesn't matter to me a lot of the time, because I struggle with like, well, I know the end. Like, I know the end, and what are you going to tell me that is going to make it matter more? And in the case of Star Wars, now I will specify. There's prequels like thousands of years before, like the Old Republic, or hundreds of years before, like the High Republic, that fill in total eras that we have no idea what happened. Yeah, eventually we know there's the Empire hundreds of years later. That's different. But like, you know, characters we know, like if they do a backstory for, I don't know, I can't even think of a character in my head. You know, if do I need a backstory for every character, right? Do I need to know where John Wick? Do I need a prequel of John Wick? Let's use that. No, probably not. You know, like I actually appreciate that you continue to fill out the world by moving forward and explain it to me. But in the sense of Darth Vader, you know, I think, and again, as a prequel fan, I obviously hold this position. Darth Vader, when you see him, can almost feel a little one-dimensional. Like, I don't think you have the same layer of depth with Darth Vader. You're like, he's this big bad guy. He's awesome. He's just got this amazing voice and presence. And he's got kids. Well, what happened there? But he's not very sympathetic, right? Until the very end of Return of the Jedi, I think, when he, you know, chunks.
Well, sorry, we're talking about the original trilogy right now, right?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, yes. Okay. So, you know, Darth Vader can just feel very, you know, one-dimensional, big, scary, awesome. But what is there behind the mask? I have to fill it in for myself. And I think what they gave us was Darth Vader is actually a really sympathetic and likable character, right? So I think what the prequels did, you know, did we explain too much? Yeah, we kind of ruined the mystique of some characters. For you, it ruined, I want to say ruined, but for you, it didn't meet your expectations of like this cool mystic character for the Emperor.
Right.
And it didn't maybe meet like what you expected of Darth Vader. But for me, it's like, well, you know, it made Darth Vader likable. Like when I see the original now, when I see Darth Vader, like I'm like, oh man, I really wish him and Padme still would have made it. You know, like I wish this was a world where I have that emotion for him now. Or like, I can't believe that he killed Obi-Wan. I can't believe that those two brothers in arms didn't, get to live and have, just those adventures together forever. It adds that sympathy, for me. And then with like the Emperor, it's like, well, now I know he's this like scheming mastermind, and he, played the chess pieces perfectly. And I think did they need to explain all of it in the prequels, and does it ruin the mystique, especially if what you had in your head is better? There's always that, sometimes what we make up in our head, we just like better, and nothing you're going to tell me is going to be better than what I thought. But to me, I think it was successful in just giving Darth Vader, I think, a good full story of child of destiny, or child of prophecy, I should say, and his downfall, and then his redemption, and his heir going forward. I think it works. I think they explained a lot, but to me, it makes it feel whole. Simple as that.
This is where I fundamentally disagree with you in prequels, is that it doesn't work for me, and I'll explain why.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know how much my knowledge, I don't want to claim that I'm any more understanding of storytelling than anyone else. Just because I have BA in film and animation doesn't mean I'm more knowledgeable than anyone else. But I feel that the most effective stories are the ones that tell you just enough to evoke an emotion. Sure. And one of the examples I always like to bring, Conan the Barbarian. When you see the live action movie with Arnold, it doesn't begin to do the character justice. Because what do you see? You see a classic American adventure film with handsome, Anglo-Saxon actor who is out there and is kicking ass, right?
Yeah.
And when I discovered Robert E. Howard and those original tales, not even comic books, but the original author, that he wrote his stories in 20s, it turned my world upside down. I realized that he was Edgar Allan Poe of earliest 20th century. He's an absolute master of short form storytelling. And the reason why is that, and Josh, I have not encountered this in any other literature, and I strongly encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, just to read one short story. Yeah. It takes Robert E. Howard literally one paragraph to make you forget the world around you. It takes him one paragraph to completely soak you into the story, and you just can't stop until you finish. At least that's the effect I have. Yeah. He's absolute, like if you take a blacksmith or a wordsmith, he's an absolute peak of that, because he constructs sentences and paragraphs in such a way that it builds and it creates a character in front of you and gives you the rest to just fill with your imagination. And when you see Vader in the original saga, and I specifically want to home in on his portrayal in The Return of the Jedi, he is he's a playground, a sandbox of imagination. And I felt when the special editions of the original saga came out, remember that scene where he's about to get rid of Palpatine, and Palpatine is torturing Luke, and he looks back and forth, goes, oh no, and he grabs Palpatine and he kills him. I enjoyed the special editions in general. I think they had a lot of interesting effects and stuff like that, except all the CGI. But I felt that scene ruined the atmosphere with that. No, it tries to give voice to something that is supposed to be left for imagination. And that to me is the entire issue with prequels, where you see this masked dark knight and there's a darkness to him. And there is sort of context given when he is there with Luke also in the Return of the Jedi. He says, "It is too late for me, my son." And he's standing there behind Luke's shoulder. He ignites the saber and Luke goes, "Well, then my father is real." There's so much context there. There's so much to extrapolate, but only enough is said for Josh to interpret it one way. Yeah. For Ben to, you know what I'm saying? And I feel that the reason that the original trilogy resonates the most with people today, the reason that movies like Goonies still holds its own to this day, the reason that The Aliens 2 is one of the greatest films ever made, is because it gives you just enough for you to understand what the heck is happening, and the rest is up to you. It's like a good book. When you read it, when you read Tolkien, he will describe you how the grass smells. He will tell you the smell on this dwarf and this elf when he pops the arrow, how he brushes it against his temple. Yeah. Too much detail. It's a world classic. Nobody argues that there is so much detail. I enjoy a piece of work like Robert E. Howard, where he's like, Ben, he gives you a spark and he ignites your imagination.
Makes sense. No, it makes sense. It's all, like you said, it's all, And part of it for me is that I never knew a Star Wars where the prequels didn't exist. And so there was never a world where I had, 4 or 5 years to think about like these characters. The answer was always provided for me. And so that definitely changes it. But it makes sense, to wrap it up, right? You just said aliens there. It makes me think of Prometheus. I don't know if you've seen the Prometheus series.
Yeah, I have.
But I actually really like Prometheus. But a lot of people, and there was Alien Covenant after that, right? It was the sequel that technically kind of eventually tells you where the aliens came from. Yeah. And a lot of people hated that. They were like, this is dumb. Like, you've kind of ruined it for me. I actually like Prometheus for one of the reasons you said, where it kind of started to hint at what could have created this aliens, but really didn't give you much of an answer. It was like, you saw the remnants of like some civilization, and it's like, what the heck were these? And you literally see echoes of like through the holologs of like what they were and there was such an eeriness to that was so successful. So you always do run the risk with over explaining, especially if you take away, like you've said several times, the mystique, right? I never had that experience just because the mystique was never there. I never had a chance to have the mystique. The only thing I could, add that I could say is it's really what the sequels were for me, where, well, you took the characters that had endings that I kind of made up in my head, and then you killed Han Solo, you killed Luke, you killed Leia, and that was not, and by the way, the things they were apparently doing between, when I saw them to when I saw them now weren't that interesting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see. But like, I get it. I mean, that would be the sequels for me, because I did have all those years. With
That's an
movies.
Excellent, a very interesting comparison. Yes. Yeah.
So I think you see that. So it's undeniable that when you give me 10 years, 15 years to come to my own conclusions, to come to my own closure, and then you're like, hey, I'm opening it up. Here's what happened. And it's like, well, this is like, you've kind of damaged what I thought happened.
Yeah.
So it's the reality. And we've said it before. I think it's probably a good way to end. Like, there's a risk with anything you love.
Yeah.
And adding more to it.
Yeah.
Right. You're always going to, by having the Bad Batch, there's a risk they do something in the next couple episodes that like, oh, what? Like, I hate that. Yeah. Some people hate that the clone troopers have inhibitor chips, whatever it might be. Yeah. But I think you and I both agree. I'd rather they give it a shot. We get more Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
So we can have more conversations like this than if they don't, because I think you especially do a really good job of being like, well, I didn't really like the prequels. They really kind of bothered me. And I still don't really love them. I like pieces of them more now, Yeah. But I mean, I still love the originals. Didn't change anything for me. I still love the originals. Those movies still mean a lot to me. And, even though that it kind of, damaged maybe some of my own opinions. Yeah. Hey, I got the Clone Wars out of it. I love that.
There you go. And
there you go.
I think no fan would argue. I don't care if you're like prequels fan or sequels fan. The Skywalker saga really ends with Episode 6.
Yes.
It ends there. Josh, thank you so much for stopping by and having this chat with me. Every time I talk to you, my mind expands. I have always a different look at Star Wars. Next episode, whenever you have time to jump in, I specifically want to dedicate an entire episode talking about the prequels lightsaber duels.
Okay, yeah, that's fun.
That's big ass topic, and there's I'm pretty sure you have very passionate thoughts about it as well as I do. Before we part ways, could you please remind my viewers what do you do? What's your channel? What are you all about?
Yeah, the channel is Star Wars on High. It's pretty easy to find. I will give you an updated link, Ben, for the future. But we just talk about everything Star Wars. Try to make videos throughout the week. We have some High Republic stuff coming up, and I'm trying, and we'll see. Ben and I are trying to get some sort of show. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we'd like to have some sort of Thursday night live show where we react with the fans, whether we stream it on my channel, his Facebook page, whatever. We'll figure something out. So be on the lookout there. We'll try to make it happen. But it's been fun. I love having, I love just talking Star Wars, with people who think about it as much as I do, as opposed to, maybe some of those casual conversations. So,
or trash it, like High Republic sucks.
Yeah. I have a lot of videos of that, but it's a lot of fun to just go back and forth, with someone who's really passionate. So I appreciate you having me back.
All right, guys. See you later. Please, if you enjoyed this podcast, hit that bell button. I'm Benjamin. I do Star Wars books and comic book reviews, character highlights, all that jazz. See you later, everybody.
Thank you.